So if you are finding our YouTube channel for the first time, my name is John, and this is Beyond Belief Sobriety. We're a podcast that explores secular options to recovery from addictions of all kinds. And we have guests, and we do live streams once in a while. And today I have a guest. His name is Paul Schulte. So if you're interested in AA history, this podcast episode is absolutely for you. Especially now, if you're a fanatic of AA history, you know that Bill Wilson was influenced by William James' book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, A Study in Human Nature. James is considered the father of American psychology, and his book is based on some lectures he gave at the University of Edinburgh between 1901 and 1902. I have not personally read that book, but I've been told it makes for some difficult reading. So I'm very grateful to my guest today who has read the book, so we don't have to. That guest, again, is Paul. I know, It's very nice. Thank you, Paul. So the name of that book is We Agnostics, How William James, Father of American Psychology, Advanced a Spiritual, I will turn my email off, a spiritual solution to addiction. Paul has had a career in finance in both the public and private sectors, and he's taught business, public policy, and law and diplomacy at universities in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Hong Kong. He has a BA and MA in philosophy from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and a Master of Arts in International Finance from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He also has a credential in counseling, specializing in drug and alcohol addiction from Loyola Marymount University, and he counsels, consults, and teaches in Hong Kong. So welcome, Paul, to Beyond Belief Sobriety. So nice to have you here.
Thank you.
I think probably the place to start would be just to give the listener a brief synopsis of who William James is.
Okay, so he was a brilliant man who came from a Boston Brahmin, very wealthy family. There was 5 kids. In that family, you were either a super overachiever or you kind of bit the dust. His brother was Henry James. Henry James was gay, and he moved to London and stayed in London most of his life. He never came back to the U.S. He's probably one of the most famous novelists in the 20th century. And William James was he's probably most famous because, there's only one person in the history of Harvard who set up basically 2 departments. He was the dean of the Department of Psychology in the 1880s, and then he became the dean of the Department of Medicine. And so he was basically, one of the early founders of psychiatry. He was a major influence on Freud. He developed the idea of the subconscious before Freud did. Oh. And Carl Jung studied under William James in 1907 and 1908. And so a lot of Carl Jung comes from William James, and people don't give William James credit for that.
Well, that's interesting. I think I've seen before like a chart that shows how different psychologists have been impacted, and it always starts with William James cascading on down, doesn't it?
Yeah, indeed. It's so true.
Yeah. So what inspired you to write this book?
Well, my story is that I come from, I did well for myself. I had a good career, and, I left home when I was 17. I went to the East Coast. I worked at the White House. I graduated, in Washington. I went to the Fletcher School. I came overseas, and I was drawn back to my roots to sort of figure out my family roots, and I really had to come clean about the fact that my own family was a family like William James. His brother had died of alcoholism. Right. His brother was a Civil War veteran who had terrible PTSD, who never recovered. And actually, he died in William James' home because, William James, as mighty as he was in his capabilities, couldn't cure his own brother. My own brother died of alcoholism as well. My father died of alcoholism-related disease. And so what I had to confront was the reality that my own family was so badly damaged by alcoholism. And so I started to get my own act cleaned up because I figured that I needed to quit drinking and get away from it because I didn't want to end up, in that condition. And so I, sort of started the sobriety route, and I looked at this thing called the Appendix 2 in the back of the big book, and I was like, "Who is this guy?" And he was mentioned in Chapter 1. He's the only guy whose first and last name was mentioned in the first edition. Even Silkworth's name was not mentioned in the first edition.
I did not realize that until I read that.
Yeah, he would have lost his license to practice medicine.
Amazing.
Yep, and so William James is the only person whose first and last name is mentioned in the original text of the first edition. And so I thought, this guy's important. So I picked it up. It was hard going, but I was just enthralled by it. So I read it at least 3 times. And then I thought, there's something here that I want to explore. And, and I talked a lot about it in various, settings. And a lot of people were like, yeah, that's really interesting. I tried to read it. I put it down. It's too hard. It's too ponderous. And of course, as you said, it was a series of lectures, and we don't talk like we write, and so those were transcribed lectures. That's what that book is.
Yeah, and that's why I no longer do transcripts for this podcast. They are very difficult to go through and edit.
That's right, exactly right. And so nobody bothered to edit that book very well. And so the book is 400 pages long with a lot of endnotes as well, and a lot of postscript notes he put in. And so I went through the book 3 times, and I outlined the entire book, and then I outlined the big book, and I outlined the 12 and 12, and then put them together. Cool. And I was astonished by the profound similarities.
I never realized that the term higher power was coined by William James.
Oh, indeed, exactly. And in fact, what happened was that it was actually Veterans Day. So it was this week in 1934. Right. So basically, Bill Wilson, fell apart, during when the Depression happened in 1929. He was a multimillionaire. He would have been worth like, $20 million in today's money.
I did not realize that until I read this.
Yeah. And then he was completely wiped out by the crash of the stock market. He was an analyst and he was very much sought out. The last project he was doing was for Hirshhorn, the famous Hirshhorn Museum. And Hirshhorn, listen to this, Hirshhorn said, "You know what, Bill, I'm going to give you one last chance, and don't drink and don't screw this up." And this was about 1932 or something like that, probably end of 31, 32. And he said, "I want you to go to Canada. I want you to look at a new technology that's extremely important. Don't mess it up. The technology is called uranium."
Oh my God.
And guess what happened? So Bill Wilson goes to the Canadian border, and he gets stinking rotten drunk, and he gets into a huge fight on the border, and he's kicked out basically. And that was the end of it. Hirshhorn said, "Forget it, get lost, go figure yourself out." So then of course, 1934 comes around. Bill Wilson is like, to hell with all of this. And that's where his cousin, Ebby Thatcher, comes to visit Bill Wilson in 1934 with the Varieties of Religious Experience. He said, "Look, I brought this book. Someone told me about this book." And Ebby Thatcher said, "Look, this book is about this guy, William James, and the middle third of the book is all about dealing with alcohol and drugs." And at the time, the main drugs that William James was working on with his patients were basically barbiturates, sleeping pills, cocaine, opium, and another one that was big at the time, nitrous oxide.
Right.
And by the way, William James, even in the book, he makes a very clear reference that he had his own struggles with nitrous oxide. So that was how Bill Wilson got the varieties. He got it from Ebby Thatcher on that, the conversation over the dining room table is the famous discussion. And that's where he got the idea. And then he went to Ohio for this disastrous deal with Firestone.
Right.
In 1935 on it was Mother's Day. 1935 in June. And so it took him like 7 months to figure it out from the time he got the Varieties of Religious Experience. And then he, sort of met, Dr. Bob, and that was how AA started. But it was Ebby Thatcher who gave him that book. And that book really lighted a fire. And then, of course, as I say in the book at the beginning, Bill Wilson is very clear. He says, William James lit another candle at our table as we created this 12-step movement. He's very clear that William James is a critically important part of this 12-step movement that Aldous Huxley referred to as the greatest social movement of the 20th century.
I had no idea that Ebby brought that book. I wonder, did he get that, you think, from the Oxford group?
No, remember he was associated with Roland Hazard.
Right. Yes.
And so they knew each other, right?
That's right.
And Roland Hazard was under the care of Carl Jung.
That is right.
And so I presume Carl Jung gave Roland Hazard that book.
Oh my goodness. Interesting. And that's
Roland
how it got into Ebby. Interesting.
That's right. And then Roland Hazard got it to Ebby. Roland Hazard was the son of the mayor of Albany. And was super cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, alcoholic. He was in his house. His father was the mayor, and he'd be shooting his rifle outside the window, shooting the birds. And so, so his father sent him to Carl Jung to get cleaned up, and I guess he brought the book back from Carl Jung.
Yeah. So going back to James and his finding that term higher power. Now, there was some interesting things about William James in there and his ideas about religion, which kind of surprised me. He didn't really think that religion, if I understood what you wrote in there very well, was really the way to go, but that there were principles that religion was built on that he was looking at. And when he was talking about higher power, I suppose that he would let people define it for themselves, but was he thinking more in terms of the higher self or something that is within each of us? Or is he actually thinking about a supernatural deity as the higher power?
No, not at all. I think he came to understand the higher power as, in fact, there's quite a few times when he would say, we jump onto a higher power amongst ourselves as our lower self or our lower
right. He talked about the two natures. We have a higher self and a lower self.
That's right. As our lower self is falling to pieces. I just love that phrase. That I fell in love with that phrase, and that's kind of what happened to me. My lower self was falling to pieces, and what happens is you jump onto a higher self or a higher power, and he does use those terms interchangeably. And he says we jump onto a higher power even if for a brief moment.
Right.
And that's where that understanding of higher power and as we understand him becomes so clear in the big book, to get away from so many people who came in then, and I think even more now, disgusted with religion, to be quite frank.
Right.
And the beauty of what William James was talking about for that several month period of those series of lectures, I believe they would have been about 3 or 4 months of lectures. I think you're right. I think it spread into 1902 from 1901. Was you had every famous there was a who's who of the global religion.
Right.
They wanted to come and talk and hear him talk about the subconscious, because William James said, if we have a religious sense of a spiritual sense of ourselves, it lies in the misty edges of the subconscious. He says his words are so beautifully
interesting. Yeah,
and they came to understand what that was, because that was a brand new concept that he developed, that Freud had really really taken to town. But he was talking about that. But he in front of this room of some of the top imams,
right.
bishops, some of the top people from the Greek Orthodox Church, Islam, Sufism, a lot of the spiritual leaders, the transcendentalists of the time, all that jazz. He was saying all of this has nothing to do with religion.
Yeah.
A spiritual experience comes before, not after. Religion comes after, not before. And
He
then he
saw it
said
as a
something.
very human condition, didn't he?
Absolutely.
And kind of intrinsic in human beings.
Not only that, he goes into a much more radical step. He says, not only is this it's so utterly human for us to fall back on this desire for a spiritual awakening, a spiritual birth, due to what he calls a period of self-despair. A period of self-despair where everything I do only causes matters to get worse. That is the period of the jumping off point.
Right.
And so, you know how Kierkegaard calls it a great leap forward? William James is the opposite. He says, you fall back, you relax, you give up, you surrender.
Right.
The harder we fight, the worse it gets. You don't jump forward, you fall back.
Interesting.
And in falling back, you fall onto a higher, better part of ourselves as our lower self is falling to pieces. Parts of ourselves that we used to see as being gratified by sex, alcohol, nitrous oxide, opium, heroin, cocaine, all of the drugs of the day, will turn cold, and they will crystallize and turn cold. Other parts of ourselves will gather and turn hot. And so he uses kind of a hot and cold analogy as well, as this reconfiguration is occurring. And I thought that just was such beautiful language. And of course, I had come from a Catholic home, a deeply Catholic conservative home. When I was in Washington, D.C., I was in Catholic seminary. I was in the National Seminary of which is the Catholic University of America, which is the papal university of the United States. And I had a very disciplined program where it was 5 years. So I spent 5 years in a monastery, and guess what? I left there with no faith.
Isn't that funny? That's real. That is so interesting.
It is now. It is now. At the time, it was not. I assure you. I was just like, what have I done?
Is it because you learn about this? This is what I find so interesting. I find first of all, I find religion interesting, and I find the Bible interesting, the history behind it, how it's put together. But when you kind of understand it and you learn about that, I've had other people who've studied religion tell me that they realize, okay, this was created by human beings. Was it? And I don't want to diverge into this, but was that kind of what happened with you?
Well, that's right. I mean, when you're in these places, the curtain's pulled back. It's like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Well, the curtain gets pulled back, and you see sort of the sanctum sanctorum. Yeah. And it's neither holy or holies. Right. And so that is the big problem with being inside, and even being, when I was working at the White House, being inside the White House made me very cynical about how policy is made.
Sure.
When we're in the inner sanctum, we get to see how grubby and dirty and ambitious, and conniving people can be in the name of some higher, some great crusade,
Sure.
Now, the thing that I want to say, John, also is that William James was also very radical as the lectures went on. He said, by the way, not only is a spiritual experience way before religion, and if you want religion, that's great, you can get it, but a spiritual experience is vital. He was much more radical about that. It's amazing they didn't string him up and burn him at the stake, because he said, I'm going to show you in this series of lectures, and he was highly compelling, that, and I'm going to go through, in what probably, I would guess maybe the 400 pages is maybe 40 hours of lectures. I'm going to go through all this, and I'm going to show you over 3,000 years, the spiritual experience of virtually every single religious group in the history of mankind is identical.
Identical. Yeah.
And so he goes through Sufism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then he goes through sort of Protestantism, the Catholic, sort of the New Testament, and then he talks about the mystics, the Catholic mystics. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. And he goes into the transcendentalists. He loves those guys. A lot of the work is in that. And then he mixes and matches the people that he had dealt with as patients who were drug addicted or addicted to sleeping pills, heroin, opium, alcohol. And he was always wondering, how do these people suddenly, one day that they're drinking their head off and the next day they couldn't even entertain the thought of a drink. And he was so struck by that. And I believe that was on his mind so much because of his brother. His brother's name was Robertson. His brother had never gotten better. And of course, PTSD just wasn't diagnosed back then. And so his brother was a terrible alcoholic. And he also had a very deeply mentally ill sister as well.
Yeah.
And so I think he was after trying to find out, about this curious reality, because he himself in 1895 was climbing in the Adirondacks. And he had a kind of spiritual awakening from a period of morose depression.
That's right. He was going through a depression.
That's right. And he sort of clicked out of it. And again, he himself can attest to something that it's a private experience. It is it's a moment of self-despair. It's jumping onto a higher power. We can only see it from a distance. It's almost impossible to explain. We jump onto a higher, better self, part of ourselves, as our lower self is falling to pieces. And then three things happen, which is very much what the steps are and what religious history has been for 3,000 years. One, you have to, burst, the dam bursts, the water flows, and the tears of joy push away the ancient wounds and the ancient sins. Beautiful, beautiful language. Right, and so there is a period of great grief, and after that, there's a need for confession of all the past wrongs, and then after that, there is a sense. Two things happen: a sense of community, I belong, a sense of democracy. I no longer feel alone, and I feel connected.
That is a good description of the recovery process today that we know.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and you can see that, and that's why when I put a lot of the language of Bill Wilson next to William James, a lot of it's really uncanny, astoundingly uncanny, and even I looked at a lot of the stories in the back using the 4th edition of the Big Book, and a lot of the human stories of the stories in the back very much match the human stories as he expresses the stories working with his patients who are somehow incapable of stopping drinking at one day, and then the next day, couldn't even consider the idea of picking up a drink. Now, I want to tell you something else that's really fascinating, because this is a weird, quirky, freak thing. Remember when Bill Wilson met Dr. Bob, when Henrietta, she was the wife of one of the scions of the Firestone family, and she introduced Bill to Dr. Bob. Well, crazy, right? They were both from Vermont.
Right, that's right.
And I think that just, set it off, and that's probably why they were there for 5 hours, because they're ornery.
They had so much in common.
Yeah, they were ornery people from Vermont. Well, guess what? Bill Wilson's grandfather was also hiking in the Adirondacks.
That is right, and had that experience.
Bill Wilson's grandfather had this exact same experience as William James, both of them climbing in the Adirondacks. And so there's these kind of weird things in history, isn't it? It's fascinating.
I was going to ask you about another term that he uses, and I had to kind of define this for myself, because it's used throughout the book. It's called soul sickness, or people that have a soul sickness. And the way I'm understanding that is the psychological scars, the trauma, whatever it is that goes into contributing to our addiction. Is that what you think he meant, because I mean, he's using language. He's from the 19th century, so he's speaking a little bit differently than I would speak. And I just want to kind of get a good grasp of what he's talking about when he describes. And he also says you've got the people who have the soul sickness, and then you have the ones that are happy, that have not experienced.
Yeah,
that.
That's right. That's right. No, that's a great point. And the book is basically 20 chapters. I guess 20 lectures. It probably was 20 lectures.
Okay.
Because it's just put out Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 20. Probably 2 through 5 spend a lot of time on that idea of this soul sickness. What is it? He's
right.
trying to articulate what is this soul sickness of people. Why do they have it? How come some don't?
Mm-hmm.
And so I love a couple of phrases. He says, he is convinced at that time, without saying, this is a genetic condition. Genetics didn't even exist back then. And there was one guy who was like the William James.
Oh, he said they seem to be born that way, right?
They seem to be born that way. That's exactly what he said. And of course, the William James Society.
That comes in the big book as well.
Correct.
That's a big book in how it works.
That's exactly right. And it's the exact same phraseology. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's written. That was written and typeset before it was published in 1934, right? So, and William James died in 1912, and so it's exactly right. It's exactly the same language, and so William James also he describes these soul sick people. Their mind is like a shuttlecock going back and forth in a badminton game. What a great analogy, right?
Yeah, really good.
They're cursed with opposing emotions, going one against the other. They can't make up their minds about what is important. They can't seem to stay focused. And then the other people, these goddamn happy people. There's a great phrase he uses. He says they seem to have been born with an extra bottle of champagne for their credit. Yeah.
Yeah, that was funny.
Right, and so we just don't know, and again, I think we genetics now. When I did this work at UCLA and for the other book I wrote on gay and bisexual drug addiction treatment, we spent a lot of time on that in some work I did at UCLA when I did my internship. Probably 70% of people in these recovery programs have a genetic predisposition. Yep. And then 30% don't. We don't know why those 30% do, but 2 out of 3 people in 12-step programs will have a genetic condition. An aunt, an uncle, a mother, a father, or a grandfather or a grandmother who was an alcoholic, and all of the terrible consequences that come from that. And so we're trying to figure out, William James is trying to figure out in the second part of the book, how do we name this soul sickness? What are the characteristics of it, right? So he says we need to treat the soul sickness as a complaint, right? If someone comes into the doctor's office, they have a complaint. I have a runny nose. I have a fever. I have a headache. My leg is killing me. What's the complaint?
It's our symptom.
What the symptom, right? What are the symptoms, right? And the symptoms are, I can't live my life. My life doesn't make sense. There's a great phrase he says. They see a darkness in the world that other people don't see.
Right.
There's 2 phrases he uses. One of them is, they are the ones who sit at the banquet of the table, and all they see is the worm, going through the apple. Right. That's all they can focus on is the worm in the apple. The rest of the banquet they can't focus on. Another one he uses that's very beautiful is they are the ones on the outside, looking into the buffet, the beautiful setup in the restaurant. They're the ones on the outside looking in the window, and they can't figure out why they're on the outside looking in. And those are like 4 or 5 of the beautiful analogies of how he tries to narrow down the complaint of this soul sickness. And by the way, he makes another great point. He says, trying to tell a happy person He calls them happy-minded people.
Right. Okay.
Right. So there's the happy-minded people and the soul-sick people. Trying to tell a happy-minded people about why a soul-sick person is staring at the worm
Right.
in the apple when there's, pork and steak and lamb and chicken all over the place. You're wasting your time. They're never going to get it. That's
Right.
why normal people never understand what an alcoholic is talking about. It's like, well,
Right.
just stop drinking. What is the matter with you? Stop it.
Right.
Right. So there was a fundamental disconnect.
Sure.
And I think now we know that,
Yeah.
especially, in Al-Anon, right? In Al-Anon is where you learn that beaten into your brain.
Right.
Don't try to, talk to an alcoholic about his problem if you're not an alcoholic, because you won't
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. So the rest of your book, you actually go through the 12 steps. You go through every step, and you talk and you show us where William James influenced that step. And I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit before we sign off.
Yeah, so of course, Bill Wilson did have the influence of the Oxford group, but the 12 steps as we know them today are very different from the 6 steps of the Oxford group.
Right.
First of all, and second of all, I tell people in 1937, Bill Wilson was bringing so many drunks to the Oxford group meetings. People got so pissed off, like, why are you bringing crazy, drunken, smelly, crazy people to our meetings? We don't realize he was expelled from the Oxford group.
I did not know that.
Yes. In fact, he was expelled with, there's a phrase, he was expelled with, like, determination. There was a phraseology like that's like super expelled. Like, don't ever.
I did not know that. I thought he just left.
No, they were like, don't ever show your face here ever again.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he was on his own in 1938, and so there was a lot of reliance on as you can see in the literature, on the varieties. And so in let's say in step 1, you can see the language
Right.
coming, which is basically, it is a surrender, right? That was a very radical idea back then, because what was being shoved in people's faces was either go to some jail or sanitarium and just lock the key and you're a goner. They just leave you for dead, or these terrible swearing off and these groups in Ireland that were, I forget the name of them, but they were like people who swore they were never going to drink from a very early age, supported by the Catholic Church. And of course, there was the Prohibition movement where they would just go in and break into saloons and destroy everything and burn
people
them
would
down.
sign pledges.
The pledges and spas and long 3-hour boiling hot baths.
Yeah.
And of course, Bill Wilson was in Townsend Hospital many times. And he was dying, and Silkworth said, "Look, you've been, this is like your 6th trip here, and we can't do anything for you." And so this idea of surrender is at the time was utterly radical, and that's exactly what the foundation of William James, approach to the addiction issue of the soul sick is to escape, and by surrender, to throw away any sort of regard for the future, give up give up the struggle. The more we give up the struggle, the easier it becomes. And this was really radical at the time.
I could see that. I could see how that'd be counterintuitive, because you think if you have a problem, you just kind of work harder to solve it. But
amen.
Yeah. So he also saw, if I read this correctly or understood it correctly, he saw William James wasn't looking at steps. So I'm always thinking in terms of steps, because that's all I know. But William James was seeing this process, and what we know as the first 3 steps. Did he see that as a passive process where these are events that occur and you just allow to happen, and then before you move on with doing something to keep it going?
Yeah, that's a great point, John. You hit on something really important. He says two things that really probably irked the Protestants. Really wanted to burn him at the stake, especially like the Calvinists. And he said, "Look,
Yeah, right.
I want to tell you two things. First of all, you will be struck. I'm going to show you how the human experience of a spiritual awakening is a totally passive affair.
Yeah.
The more passive we are, the more effective it is. And that's like the whole foundation of like
Right.
the Protestant work ethic is undercut by that. The second part of that, which is also pretty breathtaking, is that it's not just a passive affair. He says, let go your grip, right? Don't try to hold on to anything. Let go of your grip, give up. It is a passive affair. We are observers in this transformation of a jumping off point to the higher self, as our lower self is falling to pieces. It's very beautiful, beautiful stuff. And I think when I read it, I was like, that seems to be what happened to me. And
Right.
And I think if you want to talk about like the steps of William James, I think basically it's 5. It's basically something critically important. 1, the jumping off point, the passive affair. It's a passive affair, deeply personal, utterly personal, from the heart. It has nothing to do with anything intellectual. You become, there's that gift of tears, washing away those ancient sins. You pull off the hypocritical smearing ointment. And we realize something critically important. We realize that we are all made of the same clay. I just love that phrase. We are all one. We are all one as humankind. And that oneness makes us belong. We feel like we're part of something. We feel connected. And then comes the confession of the ancient sins. Right. And then there's something critically important, which is the whole foundation of step 12. He says, if all of this is nothing more than a spiritual experience for the sake of spiritual experience, he said, let every single book about spirituality and religion be burned.
Wow.
Because if you do not have if you have a spiritual experience and you're not helping your other fellows along the way, you are nothing. This is nothing. So the proof of the spiritual experience is in the pudding of service. And that, of course, is really a critical foundation of like step 10, 11, and 12. Right. Of the AA steps, which is get into service, help another alcoholic or a drug addict, stay cleaned up, and you yourself will stay cleaned up. And he says, the more that we throw ourselves into working with others, the better off we're going to be. And he says somehow in a world full of listen to this, in a world full of alligators and boa constrictors, when we give service, we even the bar. I just love that. It's beautiful stuff. Somehow we can even the bar in a world full of boa constrictors and alligators. And for God's sake, don't try to be a saint. Because guess what? Right. Saints get hanged upside down. Like he says, look at St. Peter. Don't try to be a saint, for God's sake. You're going to get hanged upside down like St. Peter did.
Right.
So it's another one where it's like, just be decent, be of service. And if you're not being of service, your spiritual experience is a big bunch of garbage.
I did want to talk to you about my 2 favorite steps, actually, steps 6 and 7. And you titled those as reconciling chaotic emotions and purging fear. And I thought to myself, my understanding of that, I thought that was a really good description.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. You remind me of something about the soul sickness. So William James said, the chief complaint of a soul sick person is that they are surrounded by this inexplicable sense of fear. And boy, oh boy, did the big book hit that on the head. In chapter 3, they talked about that being we are like part of 1,000 threads of fear, and the alcoholic personality is a personality driven by fear. And so William James said, the complaint that we must overcome is that complaint about fear, anxiety, depression, and basically that indecisiveness is how William James sort of nails the complaint of the soul sick. And there's a lot of similarity in step 6 and 7 about that, about how do we overcome those fundamental things. And I think for me also, that was a very true reality for me, was when I dealt fundamentally with the fear, what is the precise thing I'm afraid of? It was extremely helpful. And so I, got into the habit of saying, okay, higher power, take away this fear. And what is my fundamental fear? That I'm a fake and a fraud and a phony. And I don't know where that came from, but I can tell you right now, John, I had that my whole life.
Yeah.
I know that I had that I was in high school thinking I was a fake and a fraud and a phony. Wow. I was in college getting a summa cum laude degree, and I thought I was going to flunk out. And I got a summa cum laude, so there's something about, and I, by the way, I didn't begin drinking until I was like 25. I'm very, drinking heavily after my dad died of alcoholism. Right. But I never drank in college, and I was thinking, here I am gonna flunk out. So my if you want to call my alcoholic soul sick mind was already hot to trot and was going to the races way before I even picked up my first drink. So there's something very profoundly true in my own experience, right, about what he had to say about the soul sick.
Yeah. I just love how excited you are about William James. It's got me excited about William James.
Oh, no, I love it. I can go on and on. I mean, his words are the words are so beautiful. And some of it's hilarious, and some of it is just so kind of, it's kind of sneaky, and it's a little bitchy. And it kind of, pokes, into the sores of the religious leaders of the day. But he said, this is a spiritual experience way prior to religion. Yeah. And by the way, if you've had a spiritual experience and you need bells and incense and stained glass windows, go for it. Go for it.
Right.
Totally.
Well, your book did an excellent job. You did an excellent job in your book helping people like me who haven't read that understand the influence that William James has had on the recovery that we know today, and Bill Wilson and the big book and all of that. So you did a great job with that. But this particular conversation, you did even better at helping me understand William James' influence, and helped me appreciate what somebody like now, like almost 100 years, isn't it now? Over 100 years now.
Yeah.
The influence that person had on my life and how I live it today.
Yeah.
Never really stopped to consider that. So it's nice to know the history. I think there's a use for history. So
he doesn't
get
the credit he deserves. Yeah.
No,
he needs
doesn't.
more credit.
Right.
Carl Jung got all the credit.
He did. But Carl just learned it from this guy.
Yep.
Interesting.